Collection of Little Texts. Khuddhaka Nikàya. Vol 3. Therigatha Elder Nuns. Chapter 1. Single Verses. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys. A certain Theri of a noble family of Vesali, known as Therigatha. Sleep softly, Therigatha, take your rest. At ease, wrapped in the robe yourself have made. Stilled are the passions that would rage within. Withered as potherbs in the oven dried. How was she reborn? Long ago, a certain daughter of one of the clans became a fervent believer in the teaching of the Buddha Khuddhaka, and entertained him hospitably. She had a dwelling made with tree branches, a draped ceiling, and a sanded floor, and did him honor with flowers and perfumes. And all her life doing meritorious acts, she was reborn among the gods, and then again among men when Kassapa was Buddha, under whom she renounced the world. Reborn again in heaven till this Buddha period, she was finally born in a great nobleman's family at Vesali. From the sturdy build of her body they called her Sturdykin. She became the devoted wife of a young noble. When the master came to Vesali, she was convinced by his teaching, and became a lay disciple. Later on, hearing the great Pajapati the elder nun, foster mother and aunt of Buddha as well as head of nuns order, preaching the doctrine, the wish arose in her to leave the world and become nun, and she told this to her husband. He would not consent. So she went on performing her duties, looking back at the sweetness of the doctrine, and living devoted to insight. Then, one day in the kitchen, while the curry was cooking, a mighty flame of fire shot up, and burnt all the food with much crackling. She, watching it, made it a basis for deep meditation on the utter impermanence of all things. By that her insight meditation grew and she was established in the fruition of the state of no return. From then on she wore no more jewels and ornaments. When her husband asked her the reason, she told him how incapable she felt of living a domestic life. So he brought her, as Visakha brought Damadina, with a large following, to great Pajapati the Gautamai, and said, "Let the reverend Theris give her ordination." And Pajapati did so, and showed her the master. And the master, emphasizing, as was his custom to make it clear what she had attained, spoke the verse above. Now, when she had attained arahantship, the Theri repeated that verse in her blissfulness, for that reason this verse became her verse. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys. Mutta, daughter of a Brahmin of Savathi. Be free, Mutta, free even as the moon. From out the Rahu's jaws, moves free in the sky. Wipe off the debts that hinder your consciousness, and so, with mind in liberation, break you your fast. This is the verse of a student named Mutta. She, too, being one who had made a resolve under former Buddhas, went on accumulating good karma of age enduring effect in many rebirths. Finally, she was reborn in this Buddha period as the child of an eminent Brahmin at Savathi, and named Mutta. And in her 20th year, her destiny being fully ripe, she renounced the world under the great Pajapati the Gautamai, foster mother and aunt of Buddha as well as head of nuns order, was ordained and studied the exercises for insight meditation. Returning one day from her round for alms, she discharged her duties toward her seniors, and then going apart to rest, and seated out of sight, she began to do insight meditation herself on the mind's phenomenon. Then the master, sitting in the fragrant chamber of the vihara, sent forth his radiant ethereal form, and revealing himself as if seated before her, uttered the verse above. And she, firm in that teaching, in a short time attained arahantship, and so attaining, joyous in the words of that verse, completing her studies and promoted to full rank, she yet again uttered it, when about to pass away. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys. Punna, daughter of a millionare of Savathi. The following verse is that of a student named Punna. She, accumulating good karma of age-enduring efficacy in many rebirths under former Buddhas, was born, when the world was empty of a savior Buddha, as a fairy, by the river Shandabhaga. One day she worshipped a certain silent Buddha with a wreath of reeds. By that gaining heaven, she was, in this Buddha period, reborn as the child of a leading elite of savatthi and named Punna. When she had so dwelt for 20 years, her destiny then being fully ripe, she heard the great Pajapati, the sister and co-wife of the Buddha's mother and head of nuns' order, teach the doctrine, and renounce the world. Becoming a student, she began to practice insight meditation. And the master from the fragrant chamber sent his radiant ethereal form, and spoke this verse. Fill up, Punna, with the Dhamma. Even as on 15th day the full-orbed moon. Fill full the perfect knowledge of the Punna. And scatter all the gloom of ignorance. Hearing this, her insight meditation grew in fruition, and she attained arahantship. This verse is the expression of her blissfulness and the affirmation of her anna. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Tissa, daughter of the Sakyas, Kapilavatthu. The following verse is that of Tissa, a student. Accumulating merit under former Buddhas, Tissa was, in this Buddha period, reborn at Kapilavatthu in the noble clan of the Sakyas. Made a lady of the Bodhisattva's court, she renounced the world with great Pajapati the Gotami, the sister and co-wife of the Buddha's departed mother as well as head of nuns' order, and practiced herself in insight meditation. Then the master, sitting in his fragrant chamber of the vihara, sent forth his radiant ethereal form, and revealing himself as if seated before her, uttered the verse above. O Tissa! Train yourself in the trainings 3. See that the great opportunity now at hand pass you not by. Unloose all other yokes, cleansed from the worldly desires. And she, when she heard the verse, her insight meditation grew, and she attained arahantship. From that time on she was accustomed to repeat the lines. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Another Theri Tissa. Tissa. Join yourself with Dhamma. See the moment come. Let the moment not pass you by. For many they who mourn in misery that moment past. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Dhira. Come, O Dhira, reach up and touch the goal. Where all ceases, where sense is stilled. Where dwells bliss. When you nibbana, win. That sure transcendental state of meditation, which has no comparison. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Vira. Vira, brave Bhikkani. Who is valiant. Train your senses in the noblest culture. Bear to this end your last incarnate body. For you have conquered Mara and its host. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Mitta. Mitta, you ordained with faith. Be ever with compassion. Experience the beneficent Dhamma. Be ever in sure transcendental state of meditation. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Bhadra. Became ordained with faith. Bhadra, attain to greatness of sainthood. Develop and realize the beneficent Dhamma. And gain the incomparable Yogakhema. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Vipassana. Vipassana. Cross you serene and calm. The raging difficult flood where death does reign. Bear to this end your last incarnate frame. For you have vanquished Mara and its host. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Mutta, daughter and wife of Kosalan Brahmins. Mutta, accumulating good merit under former Buddhas, was, in this Buddha period, born in the land of Kosala as the daughter of a poor Brahmin named Khuddhaka. Coming to proper age, she was given to a hunchbacked Brahmin. But she told him she could not continue in the life of the house, and induced him to consent to her leaving the world. She was ordained and exercising herself in insight meditation, her thoughts still ran on external objects of interest. So she practiced self-control, and, repeating her verse, strove after insight meditation till she won arahantship. Then elated, she repeated, "O free, indeed! O gloriously free! Am I in freedom from three crooked things? From pestle and from my crook-backed husband. And I'm free from rebirth and from death, yes. All that dragged me back is hurled away." Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Damodina, daughter of a clansman, wife of a millionaire, both of Rajagaha, foremost of the elder nuns who were preachers. Now, she, in the time when Padumatra was Buddha, lived at Savatthi in a state of servitude. And because she worshipped, served and did honor to one of the chief disciples when he rose from his meditative trance state, she was reborn in heaven and so on, among gods and men, till Phusa was Buddha. Then she worked merit by doubling the gift prescribed by her husband to the master's half-brothers while they were staying in a servant's house. And when Kassapa was Buddha, she came to birth in the house of Kiki, king of Kasi, as one of the 7 sisters, his daughters, and 4 years lived a holy life of sexual abstinence. Finally, in this Buddha era, she was reborn of a clansman's family at Rajagaha, and became the wife of Visakha, a leading citizen. Now one day her husband went to hear the master teaching, and became anagama, non-returner, destined to archangel world. When he came home, Damodina met him as he went up the stairs. But he leaned not on her outstretched hand, nor spoke to her at supper. And she asked, "Dear sir, why did you not take my hand? Why do you not talk to me? Have I done anything improper? It is for no fault in you, Damodina. But from now on I am not fit to touch a woman or take pleasure in food, for of such is the doctrine now borne in upon me. Do you according as you wish, either continuing to dwell here, or taking as much wealth as you need and going back to your family." "No, dear sir, I will make no such goings back. Allow me to leave the world." "It is well, Damodina," replied Visakha, and sent her to the bhikkhunis in a golden palanquin. Admitted to the order, she shortly after asked permission of her teachers to go into retreat, saying, "Mothers, my heart has no delight in a place of crowds. I would go into a village abode." The bhikkhunis brought her there. And while there, because in her past lives she had subjugated the complexities of thought, word, and deed, she soon attained arahantship, together with thorough mastery of the form and meaning of the Dhamma. Upon that she thought, "Now have I reached the summit. What shall I do here any longer? I will even go to Rajagaha and worship the Master, and many of my relatives will, through me, acquire merit." So she returned with her bhikkhunis. Then Visakha, hearing of her return, curious to know why she came, interviewed her with questions on the khandhas and the like. And Damodina answered every question as one might cut a lotus stalk with a knife, and finally referred him to the Master. The Master praised her great wisdom, as it is told in the Lesser Vidala Sutta, and ranked her foremost among the Theris who could preach. But it was while she was dwelling in the country, and, while yet in the lowest path, practiced insight meditation to reach the highest, that she uttered her verse. "In whom desire to reach the final rest is born suffusing all the mind of her, whose mind is no more held by lure of sense desire. Bound upstream, so shall she be called." Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Visakha. Her story is similar to that of the Therigatha. After winning arahantship she pondered on the bliss of enlightenment, and thus announced Anna. the Buddha's discipline done. See that you do his will. And you have done it, never more. Need you repent the deed. Wash, then, in haste, your feet and sit you down aloof. Alone. Thus she asked others to follow her example. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Sumna. Her story is similar to that of Therigatha. Sending his radiant ethereal form, the master revealed himself as if seated in front of her, and spoke. Have you not seen sorrow and suffering in all the springs of life? Come you not back to birth? Cast out the passionate desire again to be. So shall you go your ways calm and serene. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Uttara. Her story is also similar to that of Therigatha. And she renounced the world under the great Pajapati the Gautami, foster mother and aunt of Buddha as well as head of nuns order. While she was meditating, the master, sitting in the fragrant chamber of the vihara, sent forth his radiant ethereal form to encourage her, through which she won arahantship about which she spoke in blissfulness. Well have I disciplined myself in body/action, in speech and in mind, intent and in attention. Craving is removed totally from roots. Pacified am I now. I know Nibbana's peace. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Therigatha. Edit. Tipitaka Sutta Pitaka Khuddhaka Nikàya Therigatha. Adapted from archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Compared with the Pali Tipitaka at www.tipitaka.org. Sumna, sister of Besetting, king of Kosala. She too, having made her resolve under former Buddhas, and accumulating good in this life and in that, was, in this Buddha period, born at Savatthi as the sister of the king of Kosala. Hearing the master preach the doctrine to the king Besetting in the discourse beginning. There are 4 young creatures, who may not be disregarded, she believed, and was established in the refuges and the moral precepts. Gladly, to leave the world, she put off doing so that she might take care of her grandmother as long as she lived. After the grandmother's death, Sumna went, accompanied by the king, to the vihara, taking much treasure in carpets and shawls, and presenting them to the order. And hearing the master teach, she attained the fruit of the state of no return, and asked for ordination. And the master, discerning the maturity of her knowledge, spoke thus. Happily rest, you venerable lady. Rest you, wrapped in the robe yourself have made. Stilled are the passions that have raged within. Calmed are you now, knowing Nibbana's peace. And when he had finished, she won arahantship, together with thorough knowledge of the Dhamma in true form and in meaning. In her blissfulness she uttered that same verse, so that it became the announcement of her Anna. Straightway she left the world for the order. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Dhamma, daughter of a clansman of Savatthi. She, too, having made her resolve under former Buddhas, and accumulating merit in this and that state of becoming, was, in this Buddha period, born in a respectable family at Savatthi. She was given in marriage to a suitable husband, but she developed faith in the path of Buddha, and desired to leave the world, but her husband would not consent. So she waited till after his death, and then entered the order and practiced vipassana. One day, returning to the vihara from seeking alms, she lost her balance and fell. Making just that her theme of meditation her vipassana grew, she won arahantship. And then she uttered this verse. Far had I wandered for my daily food. Weary with shaking limbs I reached my rest. Leaning upon my staff, when even there I fell to earth. Lo! All the misery besetting this poor mortal frame lay bare. To inward vision prone the body lay. The mind of me rose up in liberty. Therigatha. Adapted from the archaic translation by Mrs. Rhys Davids. Sangha. Her story is like that of Therigatha, but her verse is as follows. Home have I left, for I have left my world. Child have I left, and all my cherished herds. Lust have I left, and ill will, too, is gone. And ignorance have I put far from me. Craving and root of craving overpowered. Calmed I am now, knowing Nibbana's peace.